Hello, everyone, and welcome to the User Research Strategist podcast. I'm your host, Nikki Anderson, and today I have the wonderful guest, Petra Kubalcik, here with us, and we're going to be chatting all things continuous discovery. Hi, Petra.
Hi, Nikki. How are you? And hats off on that pronunciation. So good. So good.
And if everybody could see the behind the scenes, I think they would laugh. Before we dive into the topic today, do you mind just giving our audience a quick intro on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Petra. I'm from Australia. I've been a user researcher for very luckily 20 years. Scary times, but like right back when you would start out genuinely with a clipboard and, testing out your surveys on the telephone, on the landline, phoning people up. You're nodding. You remember this, right, Nikki? You can't remember that far back. You're not old enough.
Oh, we'd be surprised.
And I've had the fortune to work on agency side and client side, run my own business across multiple countries. So Hong Kong, Japan, Prague, UK, currently in Berlin. Yeah, and that's about it. And I have 3 passports, very lucky girl, very international, but user research is definitely a lifelong passion for me.
Oh, I love that. I want 3 passports. I need to figure out how
Do
to
you
do
know
that.
so lucky, so lucky. I keep saying I'm working my way through the alphabet. I've got to get the fourth one, the fifth one.
I mean, why not?
Why not? Why not? For sure.
Amazing. So I am so pumped to have you on. So just some background for the audience. Petra and I met at UX 360 in Berlin this past year. I think, what was it? May?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, time
Yeah.
flies. Yeah, and your talk was amazing. I was just blown away and I was like, okay, let's get you on the podcast. Like this feels like the right fit. So I'm so happy to finally be chatting with you and to have you here.
Very generous. And I will say, I will just fangirl for the audience. Like, what an amazing host you were of that conference. So good. And then to be like, oh my God, that's Nikki from like, all the emails I've received over the years. It was phenomenal. It was so great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, this is fun. Let's just talk about this. But no, I think our audience would not appreciate that. So we will talk about continuous discovery, which is still interesting, I feel like.
I
So
think equally as interesting. Equally as interesting. Yeah, for
I
sure.
feel I feel quite honored to be put up on a pedestal next to continuous discovery.
Yeah, you choose, to talk about one or the other. That's perfect. Perfect.
Amazing. So let's dive in because I know our listeners probably have a bunch of questions trying to understand what continuous discovery actually is. And since it's been defined 97 million times, do you mind defining continuous discovery as you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I'm lucky I've had the experience of setting it up at a number of different organizations. And I will say this, I think every organization treats it slightly differently. The only like core of what I continuously see, continuously, like a drinking game every time we say continuous, the only core that I would say or consistent that I see in the mix is that there is some kind of cadence to an activity that is happening that increases the stock of our knowledge. I would say that, right? The best versions of it, I would say also add on that there is action on the back of that. That would be the best, right? Definition of it. But that is probably what it is at its core. And then every element of that I've seen be very, very different. I mean, what do you think? What am I missing here, if anything?
No, that's completely, I agree with it. I think that it's really, really hard to nail down continuous discovery because of the multitude of ways that it's defined. And I literally think it's just a regular cadence of talking to people. But I love how you say the best case scenario is that there is action behind it because I feel as though, and I'm not sure if you've had a similar experience, that there has been continuous discovery done that I've experienced that feels pointless.
Performative?
Yes, yes,
Formative. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I would 100% agree, right? Like perhaps it's about other areas. Sometimes those can be great, right? It means you create more advocacy within the organization that you're in order to be able to, and this is speaking from being on client side, perhaps, that you are able to kind of get more people involved into research. But even if when that becomes the case, as you say, like it can feel really frustrating as a researcher if then nothing happens with the knowledge that you acquisition. So yeah, I mean, that's why I always say the best case scenarios. I won't say that, for example, there would be action every single week, but if there is no action on any of it, then I would be going back to maybe the goal of why we're doing it in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that that's a pretty important thing because especially and this was I've heard this at so many different conferences this past year is, you know, data overload, information overload. We just keep adding and adding and adding. And I feel like continuous discovery, we can fall into that pattern if we don't act on it. So it's just adding more and more and more without that action.
100%, 100%. And I think that kind of drowning in the ocean of the knowledge that you have is an absolutely tangible feeling for a lot of us, right? Not just in the research knowledge we accumulate, but the knowledge that exists across any business, the metrics that we're needing to keep an eye on, all the numbers. So, yeah, 100% without actually then plans, for example, to what we do with that knowledge as well. Do we have libraries? Do we have places? Do we have locations? It can just create more noise than it actually benefits.
Do you want to get all of your user research questions answered, all while hanging out on your couch in sweatpants? No need to join any live webinars and hope that your question gets answered. No need to Google a million different things and sift through some scattered advice that you don't really know is valid or reliable. Not anymore. I know it sounds too good to be true, but I promise it isn't, because if you become a paid Substack subscriber, you get access immediately to a community filled with user researchers that I am in every single day answering questions. Not only can you hang out on your couch, feel less alone as a user researcher, and get all of your questions answered, not only by an expert, but by a bunch of other user researchers with amazing perspectives and experience. You can do all of that on your couch in sweatpants, and I will be alongside there with you every step of the way. So join my paid Substack, get immediate access, and we can relax together solving all of your user research problems. See you there.
I want to talk about like if you're going to set something like this up because you briefly touched on going back to the goal of why we're doing this and that being such an important thing to remember, how do you get started setting up continuous discovery for that best case scenario?
Yeah. I mean, if I go back to, so you did a podcast on this. I don't know if you remember back, it was earlier this year. So top and tail for 2024. But, you like expressed really wonderfully that it's about having intention and thoughtfulness for a program like this with the goals, because ultimately this is very difficult to roll back. Like once the train has left the station, like we are on a journey here. And so for the best case scenario, I think it's about understanding, like with any research project, you really need to treat this as if it's your own research project of your stakeholder needs, trying to do a little bit of discussion around the business of what is this really going to be feeding into and what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. So as I said, is it about pulling people closer into research? Is it about people really understanding the customer? And if so, what part of the customer kind of journey do they need to be understanding? What are we trying to really discover? Because I think there's the continuous part and then there's the discovery part, right? And then ultimately, I would also say it's about then saying, if it's about the individual that's getting involved to understand the customer, who is that person, what matters to them, and what is their kind of workflow? Do they work with user stories? How might we statements? What is it that they work with and are accustomed to processing and dealing with in order for them to be able to step into this process?
Yeah, so interesting. I really like how you separated out the continuous and then the discovery. And I wonder if you can go a little bit more into depth into, why it might be important to separate those two things out or think about both of those things.
Yeah, I think, look, continuous discovery can mean very different things to very different people. And as a researcher, we love that, right? Like, what's the definition? How can we break that down and so on? I genuinely think a lot of stakeholders focus on the first part of that and then less on the second part. So what we hear as researchers, and it's always important to think about, am I talking the same language as my stakeholders in the business? What we hear as researchers is continuous discovery, and the bit that probably makes us go boo boo is the continuous, because we know how big discovery is, right? So that, all of a sudden it's huge and it's massive and it's all inclusive and it's holistic and it's deep and it's meaningful. I think from my experience so far, and I've had the pleasure to set up 3 different programs, is that actually what stakeholders are most interested is continuous touch points and not necessarily always the discovery part. So actually discovery to them is a little bit secondary of the purpose, but the label sounds really great. And that's why it's called continuous discovery.
Yeah, I really, really, really appreciate that distinction because I agree that it feels to stakeholders that it's continuous touch points, but we're sitting here being like discovery, and discovery needs to be big and as you said, deep and meaningful. And how do we do this continuously on a smaller basis? And then it starts getting very unwieldy, and then we get concerned, and then the stakeholders are like, we just wanted to talk to customers, and then everybody's upset.
Exactly. Everyone's in their own separate corners taking 5 minutes. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So
Ultimately, I think that conversation is really like the same navigation that you would on any project, whether you're talking about a usability test, you want to understand what we're trying to find out here, whether it's about an ad hoc project that is either discovery or something, very evaluative. What really is like the priority is just understanding what the stakeholder needs. And the more you can pull it and ask them to give you examples. So, for example, to say, okay, let's fast forward 6 months' time. This is up, it's running, it's working, whatever the cadence is, and so on. What is it facilitating? What's the A to B change that we've made across the business? Who is affected by this, who is involved in this, and how have they benefited from it? And if you can really get that together, you'll understand whether it's that kind of discovery piece or something a little bit more pared back.
yeah, it's almost like a vision statement for the actual program.
Yeah, definitely. A great idea.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, so can you talk through maybe for people who might not have done this before, when it comes to something like continuous discovery, it might be hard to understand like what kind of project is viable for continuous discovery and what might a goal or two be for something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really depends. And I imagine the listening audience, because I'm part of the listening audience. I know my team is, I know many other researchers that are. We're quite varied and broad, right? So it really depends what your situation is. I think sometimes it could be a project, sometimes it could be a big theme, and sometimes it is as simple as you said. I loved in the first podcast, I think you talked about walk the store, right? Like anchoring things in something very tangible. Ultimately, I think the best kind of, let's say, objective that fits this space is really, or rather, project that fits this space is one that fits the cadence of continuity, because there are certain projects and themes that don't necessarily need that continuous theme that goes onwards. So you do need that look forward to say, what do we need to keep doing within a space to keep either discovering or learning about? Or it could be that you think of it as more of a program and very programmatic. So you move away from the discovery part that we talked about and more into the space again of where do we need just continuous touch points, which is the way I like to think about the other side of the equation. And then it could really be those anchoring elements like the walk the store that you talked about, or elements that I've implemented before, like pathway playbooks and so on that you can utilize.
And I think for you, and I know this probably varies dependent on the situation because everything depends.
I'm
What
a researcher. Of course it depends.
it's like, yeah, the researcher playbook, the only thing that we know how to actually say is it depends.
It depends. How long is a piece of string? Yeah.
So I'm wondering for you, what cadences work best for either side, right? So that more like continuous discovery, theme-based versus the more project-based or continuous touch points.
I would say, and that's also dependent on who's involved, right? Are you a solo researcher and this is you running the whole thing, or is this, a team sport and others are getting involved? The various programs I've set up have looked at both, and they've had different involvements by researchers than by other people within the organization. And then the cadence comes into that. So on very tactical elements, I've set up programs where, for example, I'm the interviewer. But PMs are writing the objectives, they're writing the discussion guide, and they're debriefing, with a little bit of hand-holding on the debriefing, of course, where you create templates and artifacts for them to have and to be able to work through. And there you can do a much faster cadence, because really the scheduling is done by, perhaps research ops, perhaps yourself, or if you can get someone else involved. And the PMs are really coming up weekly with the objectives, writing the discussion guides, and laboring over those parts. Because as a researcher, you can pick up a discussion guide, and to all the PMs out there, I'm not trying to be offensive, but you can pick up discussion guides that maybe aren't like super, super top best quality and still be able to run with it. And then there's other areas that perhaps need really a lot of deeper thought. Actually, maybe one step back, I'll go back to the first one. You can do the inverse as well there, where, for example, you are writing the discussion guide, you are writing the objectives, and the PM is the one that's taking the time doing all the interviewing. And then you're using current tools, for example, like, transcribing notes within meetings and so on to be able to get the transcription of that and being able to help in the analysis. So that helps on that side. There you can be faster. And we've worked on 2-week cadences where every 2 weeks that's happening. Sometimes at one organization, we had it that we swapped those programs around. So every 2 weeks, there would be one of those, but they swapped in terms of what the roles of the researcher were. And then on the flip side, on the discovery piece, I would say that needs a longer cadence, because really, if we're truly in the discovery space and we're really going deep, not only do I want to make sure if our target is clearly defined, which it's not always, so that's difficult to front load recruitment at a really regular basis, but equally it should be iterative, I imagine. So from that case, if we were running weekly, like being able to look at the information that we've gathered, truly understand it, know what we're doing the next week, and maybe how our audience is ever so slightly tweaked based on what we've learned, too frequent a basis there means that you don't have that pathway to truly discover and learn. I see you nodding. I think you're thinking the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I found about continuous discovery that I was surprised about was that it is iterative, especially that discovery piece, because it's very difficult sometimes to run with the same exact broad question over a quarter, half year. If you are doing this, even sometimes a month, right?
Exactly.
It can be really difficult because you're constantly tweaking it, which is almost difficult because it's something we're told not to do as researchers, because we come up with our research plan and we go into, let's say, our 12 or 15 interviews, right? And maybe we'll tweak after the first one or two, but we don't really want to tweak our questions too much because validity of the data that we're getting. And so it like kind of goes against what we're taught to do in research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the way I separate it in my mind to think of it, rather than it's a longitudinal project, that it's a project that's evolving over time. And so in that way, the objectives changing, the audience may change, the topics that we want to focus on may change. It does feel sometimes counterintuitive for sure.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, because you talked about the involvement of the research team during these different programs. So how is it that you decide how involved you have to be, or how involved you can maybe not be?
Yeah. I mean, this this opens up that whole democratization of research topic, which is one that's like I love, comes up every conference. If you haven't been to a conference, then just put on any video about democratization of research and you'll feel like you were there.
Yeah.
Also, if I just say the word seat at the table, then you'll feel like you were there. Because these are eternal issues that even for 20 years we've been talking about. Yeah, I would say it's a really difficult decision, because on one hand, of course, you want to empower the people around you and lighten your load, right? Especially if you're a team of one, this is just not simply feasible to be able to execute and do on your own, unless this is your sole job, unless this is all that you do. And I think it's about understanding the UX maturity of your organization, which I'm sure you've talked about, and you can have a look at, the UX maturity spectrum to understand where your organization's at and also where you want to take them and go. Right. So the more that you involve people, the more that you can up their maturity, but you cannot leap all the way to the end if we're at the very beginning. So it's really about making that judgment call. And then I would say it's parts of the program that you choose where to involve others and where you need the researcher to lean in. So, the research skill set that you would pay most for, and that, you really, if everyone goes back to their early days, if they're, very experienced and they're learning, or if you're at the beginning of the journey, where have you struggled the most? Where have you had to learn the most and upskill yourself the most? Those are the places you want the researchers to lean in. And that would be, I would also heavily then say, clearly objective setting of the whole program, but also of any of the sessions, because regardless of who ends up doing anything, why we're there and that it's a valid reason to be there is key.
Hey everyone, I have been taking some business courses recently and am launching a new membership that's all about how user researchers can become more business savvy, more strategic, and more of a business partner in their organizations. One of the biggest questions that I get asked is, hey, my organization isn't really mature. It has like a low user research maturity level. Please do not let the maturity of your organization dictate your user research career. That's what I did because I was in a lower user research maturity. I kind of let myself stagnate and I didn't really learn new things. And with that, my skills kind of like deteriorated. I lost a lot of time that I could have used to learn really, really important skills because they weren't necessarily applicable to my organization at that time. But guess what? I got fired. And then it didn't really matter what maturity level my organization was at because I was no longer there. And I wished that I had taken the time to learn some of these skills because they would have been applicable at the next places that I went into. I know that it can be hard sometimes and frustrating when you're in a low maturity organization and you want to push things, you want to learn new things, but please, please, please don't let your current organization and their levels of maturity impact your future career because I promise you, you will not be there forever and you will need the skills that you need to learn in the future. Promise, 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 especially with the user research industry changing and us hopefully moving into that more strategic space and operating more as business partners and innovation partners to our organizations. Also, if you want more details on my membership and how to become a little bit more business oriented as a researcher, check out the link that I have and I hope that helps.
And I'm wondering, it's a lot of work. If people haven't read between the lines yet, it's a bit of work to set something
Yeah.
like this up.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, how do you go about starting that setup and getting into it? Like, are there educational components to get buy-in, things that you create, systems, processes, anything like that?
Yeah. Check, 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 check. Yeah.
A little bit of everything.
A little bit of all of that. I think, yeah, and speaking to the researchers, right? Like it's the same kind of aspects that you set up. First, why are we doing this? Understanding the stakeholders, really doing all of your interviews and all of your due diligence to know that we're setting this up for the right reason. Is this because with these programs, is it a one-way or a two-way door? Right. Once we go through this, can we turn back very easily? And I would say with continuous discovery, no, 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 no. Like it is like like I said, that train has left the station. Like we're on that journey now. And it is really difficult to say to stakeholders, you don't get those regular, touch points. To turn it off is really difficult.
Yeah.
And it's researchers, we hate generating, bad data, like absolutely, or data that's not used. So the first, once you've done this piece, everything you just talked about there is fundamental. We have to get everything lined up and ready to go. So I often think about education. So who needs to be educated about what different areas? Do we need interviewing training for individuals? Do we need note taking? Do we need how to write discussion guides, depending on how we allocate who's doing what piece of the puzzle? So really breaking down the different aspects. If it's usability tests, we may need less of that if we end up going down the usability touch point pathway, or whether we end up going down the discovery where it's far more exploratory. And then all the artifacts you can ever think of to really kind of make this so smooth for yourself. So that we have whether it's week, fortnight, month, quarter, whatever we end up doing, it doesn't matter what the cadence is. If you have the systems and the documents in place, it will make the load significantly easier. So I often think about objective documents, note-taking documents, outputs, and so on. And for the outputs, really concretely putting that together of what that's going to look like. So you're not writing bespoke reports at the end of every session.
You know what? I didn't even write reports at the end of my continuous discovery sessions. We just it was an ongoing Miro board.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's okay, because that says to me very iterative, right? And also, as long as that's agreed and that's what works for the project,
Yeah.
absolutely, right? It could be top lines, it could be Miro or FigJam, it could be reports, whatever it needs to be that is kind of agreed up front. As long as you anchor what that output's going to be, then you're clear.
Yeah, and I think it did work for us because I was working in a fairly mature team that they were able to say, okay, we've hit saturation on this thing and we can now go into an ideation. Oh, okay, we've hit saturation on this thing and we went into an ideation. So there was a lot of like action off the back of that. And
Beautiful.
oh yeah, it was that one was nice, but the other ones, I wish I could have gotten off that train and pretended that I never set foot on it.
The
So
trauma,
yeah.
I feel like that's another episode, right? The trauma tales of
Yeah.
continuous discovery.
That would be such a good one. I feel
Yeah,
like it's like a glass of wine and trauma tales.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's perfect. That's
Yeah.
perfect.
And I'm curious, like, so for these outputs that you're talking about, do you have any examples? Because we talked about Miro FigJam, there are sometimes you could do headlines or reports. Are there any other examples that you have for like outputs that you found to be particularly effective?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. I would say that like focusing ultimately on product managers is where the programs I've set up have been. So if product managers haven't been your key audience, please make sure what your key audience needs. Maybe with engineering, sometimes it's user stories and that works much better. But I would really kind of firstly check in and say, what does my stakeholder need for this? Ones that I've worked with in the past that have been really helpful. So one I've called like a pathway playbook. So it actually is like when I heard your walk the store, I was like, oh my God, it's so similar. But having a playbook of pathways that we can actually ask the user to go through, depending on what's important at that moment in time, and then having set slides for that playbook that have screenshots of the pathway with, the notes that they need to put with the expectations underneath. So like really kind of using something else to give them the expectation of how much we expect someone to debrief on if someone else is doing it. But even using that as a guideline for yourself can be really, really helpful. So same as your walk the store concept of getting people to go through the product end to end on a particular flow. And that could be, a happy flow or a sad flow, but ultimately then having that playbook together. And that's where all the notes and everything come together as accumulated. So that would be one of them.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love the structure that I imagine that gives to people who are debriefing.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the hardest parts, especially if you can't be super duper involved in facilitating every single one. It can
Yes.
be really, really difficult to make sure that the debriefs, because that's where the action comes from. That's where the decisions come from. And so making sure that those go well are super important.
Exactly. And then I would say on the other side, if we move away from the touch points, because that one gets quite tactical, right? If we think about the discovery side, there's still frameworks that you could apply to it. So, for example, simple concepts, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but, insights, benefit, reasons to believe, that could ultimately be your outputs and end goal that we end up with a full concept. But we may start the project at the beginning where we're just discovering insights about pain points or opportunities for our customers. And then once we've landed that, then we're adding on the benefits. And then once we've landed that and we keep narrowing, then we're at the reasons to believe. So, even using simple frameworks like that for the discovery can make it simpler in the long run.
Yeah, and frameworks I think are so helpful because they give us a place to start. That doesn't mean you have to be stuck in them, but they give us a place to start at least and you can adapt them to your situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what frameworks are supposed to help us with. I think sometimes a lot of us can feel overwhelmed because there's so many different frameworks out there. And usually, I don't know about you, Nikki, but for me, like, I know the ones I know, they work well for me, like, and I'll be able to throw them in. But it's fantastic when you get into different areas and you learn from your various stakeholders what frameworks they're using, right? And that's ultimately what they'll listen to. You could fight for certain ones, but if your stakeholders are using others, it's best to go with the flow.
Oh, for sure. I've been very intimately familiar with product management frameworks because I'm like, how do I make this work for user research? Because that's what they're so familiar with. And I know sometimes we're like, well, people should listen to us and, we shouldn't have to adapt. But unfortunately, because we are the support system, we will have to adapt to a certain degree.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, look, and that comes from 20 years of trying to convince people to use other frameworks. But I think ultimately, sometimes it can feel, and if we segue slightly like us and them, with different teams, I won't just say product managers with different teams, but I think when we all realize we're trying to build a better product, that's really where we're going. The lens can shift slightly, but as long as we're all pushing in the right direction, I think that's the most important part.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the end of our time, but I have two more questions for you rather than just one. So the first question being, is there a time where you would say, absolutely do not do continuous discovery? Do not set this up, run in the other direction, do not enter, get off that train.
I would say so in scenarios where the scale of this is insurmountable. So you are the only or your team is, the product management team is tiny, the support system is minuscule, the budget is non-existent, where every single angle of this you're fighting, then I would strongly suggest that this is not for your organization and not for you, because you will burn out trying to, push in every direction of resource to get it done. I would also say where the objectives are really unclear. I think we can do like continuous touch points in a different way if the objectives of what we're trying to do are not clear. If it's just about, look, we just want people in front of customers, right? Then that can feel very different. But then to set up a full program could be very complex if we don't know why we're doing it. And then there must be a third, because the best things come in three. But Nikki, you must have one. When would you not do it?
I agree with solo, resource limited. And I would say I also agree with like fighting against every step. I've learned that if you're fighting so hard to make something work, oh my God, what great life wisdom.
Yeah,
It's
it's
not
about
gonna
research,
work.
but it's not about research.
This is not just a research podcast, everybody.
Exactly. That goes to the solo piece as well. You need community, you need advocates. Loneliness is a killer, people. Like, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's like a distinct third that I can think of. But yeah, I think that the resource management is really, and like the objectives being very vague. If you're concerned about somebody taking this and running with it out of context, then that's another reason to just say, you know what, actually, let me steer a little bit more until we hit a maturity level that feels better.
Yeah. And actually, so I would add to that then from the action point of view that we talked about right at the very beginning, right? Like looping it back around. If there's no clear action that's going to come out of this, like maybe the objectives are clear, but nothing's going to change for the fact that we've done all of this work. The product pipelines and roadmaps don't change. The user, like our perception around what our users are, doesn't change. The UX maturity of the organization, feasibly won't change because no one's involved and you're doing it yourself. If there's no action or benefit, even though the objectives may be clear and you have a team to support, then I'd suggest definitely.
Beautiful number three.
Best things, best things.
Best things. Amazing. So, last question. If somebody is thinking about doing continuous discovery, maybe or already in it and trying to figure it all out, what is your number one piece of advice for them?
So I'm going to sound like a broken record. It would be like, make sure you're crystal clear on why you're doing it. Because you're going to need to keep coming back to that why. I think Simon Sinek always says successful companies are all about the why. If you're really clear, then that drives you and keeps you going when the times get tough, which they will get tough. But if you can keep going back to the why and the benefits you're delivering, I would say, yeah, getting that solid in your mind, that would be the key first step. And then build a library, Google Notebook, LM, whatever, so that you can put everything somewhere and not have to worry about it afterwards.
So smart. I'm so happy that slipped right in there. That's a perfect place to end, because I'm like, oh, let's talk about libraries. Um, be here for the next like 3 hours just chatting about. I will get a glass of wine then.
Perfect. I'm in.
Amazing, Petra. Thank you so much for your time. This was amazing. And I'm sure there are so many nuggets of information that the audience will take away. So thank you so much.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck to your audience. I look forward to hearing their success stories.
Yeah, thank you to everybody who is listening. If you have any comments, questions, please post them in the comments. And yeah, we'll talk soon.